Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the O12 sectoral Starmada. In this video we'll be going over who Starmada are, how they play, what their faction identity is, and because this is an N4 faction focus happening late in the edition just before the arrival of N5, a little bit about how we think Starmada might translate into the new edition, what might be changed and what might persist, before jumping into Infinity Army to go through some of the profiles that showcase the faction. As always, big thanks to channel supporters who make videos like this possible, including, in this case, most recently, Mickey from Queensland, who made the request for a Starmada faction focus, but there have been several other channel supporters who've requested Starmada as well, and I hope you all enjoy this. As a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so either via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Now, generic intro out of the way, what do we think about Bureau Aegis Starmada? Starmada are obviously the first sectoral that was released for O12, and they kind of fit the mold, at least at first glance and on initial release, of the very generic sectoral trademark. They are very capable of building a list that runs a very solid light infantry core, a very good tag, a bunch of attack dudes. They're almost all regular orders, and it's generally pretty easy-ish to build a list that kind of comes together and ticks all of those generic sectoral boxes. And kind of off the back of lists like that, you would almost be mistaken for thinking that Starmada are just Pan-Oceania light with a lower ballistic skill tag. But then, over the course of time, multiple releases have been added to the faction, and even from the very basic bones that they released with, there were a selection of additional capabilities in there that really do set them apart from the generic sectoral TM mold, and give them actually a really wide variety of options. Now, we are going to kind of inevitably compare them to that Pan-Oceanian sectoral kind of mold, and they do have many of those capabilities, but on top of that, they have hacking that many factions wouldn't have access to, including access to every hacking device type, including Hacking Device Plus, which means they have white noise. They have smoke and multispectral visors, which means they have access to smoke shooting, which not every faction does. They have access to some really interesting robotic support elements, unique rapid offensive units like the Roadbot, which is really interesting, and although perhaps its power has fallen somewhat from the peak it enjoyed during ITS season, I think, 13, which we will talk about, still a very interesting, unique, and powerful unit. Unlike Pan-Oceania, you have actual willpower specialists in this faction. You have access to willpower 14 and willpower 13 on things like your engineers and your hackers, reasonably accessible, including even some higher willpower specialists, although they get a little bit pricey to afford. But just as a general rule of thumb, if you play Starmada, you are typically going to be swimming in, at minimum, totally serviceable specialists, which definitely sets you apart from many Pan-Oceanian lists. And frankly, you've got pretty solid skirmishers and a few other interesting tech pieces, weird robots, stuff like that, which gives Starmada, yes, some of that flavor of the Pan-Oceanian generic sectoral model, but with tons and tons and tons of additional capability that really let you flex the faction to cover lots of different bases if you're so inclined. This makes Starmada very friendly even in somewhat hostile or difficult mission lineups. You should almost always be able to build Starmada to play basically any mission. Similarly, there should be very few matchups that Starmada doesn't at least have some kind of tool or possibility of like model mechanic that helps them deal with that. You're not quite Nomad or like Aleph level, but you definitely can build a solid info war, including, importantly, info war defense. You can build hard castle AROs, you can rely just on smaller link teams if you want. And so kind of in general, from that somewhat humble, solid, this is O12's first sectoral and it's going to be designed accordingly starting point, Starmada has spread out to be maybe not like Bakunin, where Bakunin has multiple and defined strong ways to play, but certainly a sectoral that is very well rounded and has reached a point where it very close to plays like a vanilla faction with access to full Fireteam core and Harris. And so kind of as a result, if you are an O12 player, you basically just should also be a Starmada player by default because you need to buy very, very little to expand the faction out to include Starmada. And if you are a Starmada player, the faction will serve you very well because it will let you basically play almost all aspects of the game of Infinity within that sectoral. Maybe not with really, really like powerful and focused strengths the way that some other sectorals and vanilla factions can do, but with basically nothing out of reach. And there are absolutely pieces inside Starmada that are just individually strong, powerful mailed fists, and we'll talk about those as we go through the roster. Now, in terms of limitations, the first thing to note is that Starmada still has to pay for all of that stuff. Actually, building a 300-point list with Starmada is very doable, but we're talking here about a faction where you are basically starting with 12 points as kind of the floor. You get one 7-point Flash Pulse remote, and then you can take your baggage bots and maybe a War Core, and then it's 12 points and up. There is no 10-point line infantry, which means that all of your those fire team core, the light infantry fire team core, is starting with 12-point troopers, and there are some choices that you can take in that link that we will talk about that help abrogate the cost a little bit. But we are not playing a faction like, say, Shock Army of Acontecimento, where it's just 10 points, 10 points, 10 points as the starting point, which makes building, and like, the multiple availability flash pulse bots that you'd see in Acontecimento, that makes building the high end of Acontecimento so much easier than it does in Starmada. This means you tend to have to be quite focused when you're picking your luxury pieces, particularly given that the top end of Starmada, the tag, the Zeta, is very appealing and you'll want it in many lists. And this tends to leave the middleweight luxury, like 25 to 40 point kind of piece slots in Starmada, very hotly contested if you can take those pieces at all. You have to be choosy. But it's to Starmada's credit that that 12-point line infantry and availability 1 Flash Pulse bot kind of core does not cripple the faction. And I think that is indicative of the overall quality of the pieces that are available, because in other factions that would basically be kind of a death sentence. Before Tunguska got access to Zellenkriegers, for example, the price of entry of Securitate was just a huge drag on the faction, but that has kind of never been true for Starmada, which is a real positive. Now, there are a few other kind of like minor things to note in terms of limitations on the faction. One of them is that this is less true these days now that roadbots are not the first order optimal strategy in terms of building a Starmada list, but it is still kind of easy to accidentally build a Starmada list that is very vulnerable to enemy hacking dominance or even just hacking AROs, or which is difficult to punch through. It can be difficult to punch through a properly layered defense of both templates and hacking. Like if you have an opponent that has some deployment zone mines or a chain rifle or two and a nice hacking network, the Starmada mix, at least that I prefer, of light infantry and remotes and roadbots and a tag struggles to really punch through that, because there's nothing that really wants to ball its fist and strike into that kind of a defense. Even Varangians aren't necessarily particularly well suited to that. So a really stout defense can stymie Starmada a little bit, but you should still be able to play the Pan-Oceanian style of game there, where you have firepower superiority, and so you just go and do the mission. And Starmada is absolutely very good at going and doing the mission. Finally, in terms of notable weaknesses, and this is where we stray into, keep your eye out for N5, I would say that middle and top end, particularly in terms of heavy infantry in Starmada, there's not a great series of choices. There are a few good heavy infantry options, or at least a few interesting and appealing ones, but it is not where Starmada is strongest, and I would note that things like, for example, bronzes are just absolutely prime for profile tweaks, the Shikami treatment, if you will, that potentially will make them much more interesting troops in N5. Right now, their profiles are just kind of bloated. Like, yes, total immunity is a good skill, but all of the ad hoc martial arts that don't really do anything, and of course the 360 visor strikes again, makes bronzes into really, really bloated profiles. The bronze HMG is a ballistic skill 13 HMG that costs, I think, 55 points, which is egregious. You can get tags that cost that much, or at least very close to. So keep an eye out if you are a Starmada player and you own things like beta troopers I quite like and we'll talk about, but stuff like bronzes, etc. Keep an eye out in N5 for how those profiles might change, because there's a lot of potential for them too. Now, speaking of things that will transition into N5, we're going to jump now into the army section of the video, and start going through profiles, and we're going to organize this relatively straightforwardly. We're going to start by talking about different link team options before jumping into the other like meaty common baseline choices, move on in through independent elements, and then into the spicy pieces that might, spice up a list. But in terms of things that are worth talking about in N5, let's start by just talking about the link teams, because we know that link teams are changing, and unfortunately, at time of recording, we are mere days away from getting actually some really good information about how link teams are going to work. But speculatively, I'm going to operate on the assumption that link team bonuses, based on what Corvus Belli has said, will be a little more front-loaded toward the first few members of a team, and that I expect bonuses to work based on just the number of troopers of the type that the link team is formed from, and then any other troopers don't contribute to those bonuses, but also don't break fire team purity. So to use kind of a classic Bakunin example, 4 moderators and a riot girl would get bonuses from having 4 moderators. Now that is, at this point, purely speculative. We will see in as little as a few days. But it's worth mentioning because the fire team compositions, particularly in terms of both light and heavy infantry in Bureau Aegis Starmada, are actually very good at building very pure cores of different numbers. You can easily build 2, 3, 4, and 5 strong pure cores and Harry's teams with very solid, like there's nothing wrong with any of those loadouts. And that means the faction is very well positioned to move into N5. Whatever kind of fire team composition is most optimal for N5, wherever the bonuses are like, best in terms of like, oh, do I want 5 troopers? Do I want 4? Like, do I really want 4? Do I want 3? Is it fine to have 2? Whatever that might be, Starmada is really good at doing link teams of that size because the light infantry and the heavy infantry teams scale up very nicely and maintain basically full purity all the way through, which is really interesting and solid, and again, something to keep an eye on as N5 arrives. Now, from that moment of optimism, the Kappa unit, ladies and gentlemen. The Kappa unit really is not where we are going. It's going to be the starting point, yes, for many of our link teams. You need either a Kappa or a blue coat. I quite like blue coats, but Kappas are usually going to be cheaper. You're going to need one of those two to start your link team, but provided you do, it's going to form the basis of a security fire team, and almost all of the rest of the things we're talking about will just be pure security link team additions for purposes of composition bonuses. But because there are so many things that we can add to a security team, the Kappa itself is going to be kind of overlooked a little because there's other stuff that we might want. So in terms of things that we can add to a security team, you can just run a Kappa unit, in which case you have anything up to 5 Kappa units. We'll add a few other things. We'll keep the link team cheap, and we can choose to just rely on the Kappa unit itself to be the bulk of that. There's a missile launcher, there's a multi-sniper, there's a heavy machine gun, but all of these profiles are going to be 2 points cheaper than the equivalent Pan-Oceanian kind of Fusilier, despite, for the purposes of everything those troops are going to do, literally just being Fusiliers, because the willpower and the shock immunity does not matter hugely in terms of the unit that's functioning this way. This means that the way that I tend to build these teams is going to be really just one utility Kappa and then kinda other pieces, maybe accepting the missile launcher if you want a hard ARO element. But there are a few things here that are, of utility. One of them obviously is the paramedic. At 14 points, it's a touch expensive, but it is still a whip 13 specialist. And if you're doing, obviously, paramedic is going to use your fizz of the unit that you're trying to paramedic. But when you're doing things like supplies or even just pressing general buttons, being a whip 13 specialist for 14 points is not the worst thing in the world. Much more attractive, and something that I will fit in many lists, is the 12-point submachine gun hacker. Now, this profile was one of the very first profiles that caused submachine gun panic way back when it was first released, because yes, submachine guns are much cheaper than combi rifles. They are shorter range. That's a thing. I don't particularly care about that on a hacker. I'm going to have other models in the link team that are doing gunfighting duties, and so as a result, 12 points? 12 points for a Whip 13 hacker? Yes, it's BTS 0. It's not going to carry the game, but that's a very attractive cost. And so if you have the SWC spare, and it's not too difficult actually to have the SWC spare in Starmada, and you're looking for a Kappa to start a link team, that's kind of what I would recommend. Get that nice, solid hacking defense layered into your list, and you have just an excellent starting point to build link teams from. Now, the other place that you can start a security fire team is with a blue coat, and these are very, very mixed in terms of the profiles. I am generally going to recommend just the 13-point profile to start a link team with, because if you don't take the very cheap options, you get a very, very bloated overall profile. Basically, every profile except for the adhesive launcher +1 burst heavy riot stopper profile is dealing with a weapon loadout that does not compensate for the fact that it has a kitchen sink quantity of different skills. It's got Sixth Sense and Natural Born Warrior and Discover +3 and biometric visors and that cursed 20 close combat, which is the worst close combat score to have because it costs, etc. All of those things would make for a terribly, terribly bloated profile, except that the adhesive launcher and riot stopper are pretty close to free, and it's got a para CCW -6, which means in combination with the other stuff, you actually have a model here with riot stoppers, like just by themselves. Riot stoppers are very, very unique weapons, and access to them is one of the things that sets Starmada apart, because a riot stopper is non-lethal, but represents a total mobility kill on anything that it hits, because it inflicts a strong immobilization state that can't be reset out of. It can only be dodged out of. That is not always easy, and it inflicts a significant penalty, which means that riot stoppers can, as a defensive weapon, stop something absolutely cold. Like, only models with total immunity can walk off riot stoppers. Anything else is like, I'm not sure I want to risk that. Like a Sujan barreling through your deployment zone is absolutely equally as scared, perhaps more scared of riot stoppers as it is of just the hacking network that you present. And so Bluecoat's that 13-point profile, the only one that is not just way too expensive, is actually pretty interesting. And if you need to get into close combat, although it is not a close combat expert, it is packing just enough in the CC state to pull off what I would call the Sir, this is a Wendy's level of close combat, which is that it can go into combat with an enemy expert and make their life really miserable and risky enough that they don't want to deal with activating while they're engaging it, even though it isn't necessarily that likely to win. It's fulfilling that like moderator duty of a Hassassin Fidei does not want to walk into melee with this model. Now, we are not going to see any blue coats in the list that I will showcase at the end of this video because I have other things that I've taken instead. 12-point Kappa hackers, spoiler alert, but the 13-point blue coat is a very attractive profile. The other profiles, I would suggest waiting on Infinity and 5 to see if they get any work, because if we're lucky, they will. Now, moving on from models that you must take to form the link into, frankly, some of the best link team filler in the entire game, we have Raven Eye officers. Now, these are only AVA 2, and yes, they are 12 points. Once again, it's the 12-point line infantry, but you get plenty for the 12 points that you pay for a Raven Eye officer. They are native forward observers, which means that they are perfectly serviceable specialists. Willpower 13 to boot, which means that, in a pinch you can use these to accomplish basically any objective. The main thing that you are getting is an Emarat, which is, again, a non-lethal but very, very mobility kill dangerous against hackable targets, large template weapons. Flash pulses, nice. A submachine gun, fine. There's a submachine gun panic again. But most importantly, we are getting EM mines and mine layer. Now, these are not infiltrating or forward deploying troops, but consider we have a defense. If we just take a link team, like a Herice link team of a Kappa hacker and a Raven Eye officer as the first two pieces, we have in one place two specialists, both of them willpower 13. We have our hacking defense against incursions into our deployment zone, and we have a mine layer defense into incursions into our deployment zone. Now, EM mines, and please always take the EM mines, not the cyber mines profile. EM mines are going to be, again, a little bit mixed in terms of their utility. If a bear pod comes at you, you might have a bad day because it's totally immune to this kind of stuff. And yes, by the way, bear pods generally and dog warriors are a notable weakness, right? Total immunity that can just really push through all of the non-lethal defenses is scary for Starmada to face. But setting aside that like one kind of unit archetype, you have mines in your deployment zone, hacking in your deployment zone. Just out of two 12-point models, maybe we have two of those sets. We take two like 3-person teams, maybe a 3-person and a 4-person team, and we just have kind of incidentally out of the link teams that we're building to play the game with, a really solid deployment zone defense that if you deploy and play it well, can stall out quite a lot of attackers. and we've paid almost no opportunity cost for those pieces. So Raven Eyes are things I will take probably 2 of these, at least 1, but probably 2 in any list that is running light infantry links, and I will still seriously consider them in lists that are running like a Beta Trooper, Harris, or even Core, for example. Very solid. They won't carry the game by themselves, but if we start a link team with a Kappa Hacker and a Raven Eye, we're in an excellent place. Now, I will have fairly firm opinions about what I think the best lieutenant in Starmada is, but if you are not taking that lieutenant, we'll get to it in a bit, Raven Eye officers as a lieutenant choice are also kind of just a very clean choice. If you're going to take 2 of them, you have your Raven Eye, you have your decoy, it's just kind of easy, and we aren't paying 12 points for a Kappa, which we then, etc. It's just a nice clean lieutenant if you're looking for an inactive lieutenant profile. Now, getting into non-Kappa guns that you can add into the light infantry link, we're going to drift out of the pure security core and into a wildcard, Psyclops, but Psyclops happily count as security for purposes of composition bonuses, which means that even though they're a wildcard, really they're just part of the security fire team. And although Psyclops do have some weaknesses, specifically they are Arm 1 light infantry, right? They're fragile. You get a very solid, active, in terms of being light infantry, you get a very solid series of active turn, point man of link team profiles here, provided you're willing to kind of play in that multi-marksman rifle kind of range. Now, there's really 1.5 profiles that stand out, but the big one, the one that I will use quite routinely, is the 25-point multispectral visor level 1 nanopulsar +1 burst multi-marksman rifle. In just a 3-person, even a 4-person team, this is a ballistic skill 13 or 14. In a pure core, it can go up to ballistic skill 16, but I find that 24-inch range-band weapons in pure cores are awkward. But a ballistic skill 13 or 14, multi-marksman, MSV1, mimetism gunfighter. Now, because it's only armor 1 and single wound, it is, yes, very vulnerable to bad luck. If it loses the face-to-face roll, it's going to go down just in an absolute heap. If you've got a doctor or a paramedic, you might be able to recover it, but it's only Phys 10. But that's kind of tolerable because it costs 0 SWC and only 25 points. 25 points is still kind of on the cheap end, particularly for a gunfighter of that quality. And if we're looking for a low SWC, efficient and serviceable piece to round out that kind of Harris that I've been building over the course of this example, that Psyclops MSV1 multi-marksman rifle profile is an excellent choice. It's also, randomly, a specialist operative, which means, again, we are starting to see that theme develop of how Starmada is almost impossible to run out of specialists over the course of a game. Now, while the multi-marksman is my preferred Psycop profile, it's worth just considering the hacking profiles and especially the killer hacker. It can be a little bit difficult to find really good quality KHDs in Starmada. They are not unknown, but the Psycop KHD is actually probably the best one if you aren't taking a Cyberghost KHD, which you won't always be because Cyber Ghosts are AVA1 in Starmada. And so if you are looking for a killer hacker, you can do a lot worse than 22 points for Willpower 13, BTS 6 that you can plug into a link team and have contribute to full core bonuses. It's not something I would take often, but in, say, a 2-list pairing, if I really expected to need to fight info war dominance, maybe based on the scenario or just who I knew was attending, I would give that some consideration. Now, while you can just build your link teams, your light infantry links, exclusively out of the pieces that I've talked about so far, and that works very well, we should just dwell very briefly on one of the interesting and weird pseudo-unique profiles in Starmada, which is the SECU Droid, Surveillance and Security Droids. Now, these guys are a very, very weird profile, but it is worth noting that they count both as security for security fire teams and as beta troopers for beta trooper fire teams. And although 20 points is difficult to fit easily into lists, it's also maybe cheap enough that, particularly in a beta trooper fire team, it can round out a larger team as a little bit of a discount. And the capability that these things offer is, look, frankly, it's kind of weird because they are purely defensive. They've got effectively all non-lethal weapons apart from the heavy pistol, but they've got adhesive launchers or acrylic cannons and flash pulsers, and they're only 20 points, and they have remote presence and 2 wounds, armor 2 beat or 2 structure, armor 2 BTS 6, 360 visor, which makes them effectively something akin to the beefiest war correspondent in the world that you can then link for 6 cents and bonuses, say like ballistic skill bonuses, burst bonuses, and arrow, etc. as these weird, repairable, purely defensive ARO pieces, provided your opponent does not have bear pods. But if your opponent does have total immune models, you do still have the heavy pistol, which if it's a total immune model, it's probably not able to contest you at range, so you can just gat with the heavy pistol. And I have inflicted wounds on bear pods with a linked SECU Droid at range because they just didn't want to have to deal, like they had to contest that with smoke because I was going to shoot them with the heavy pistol if they didn't, and I got the shots through. Now, SECU droids are ultimately a niche pick, particularly in the context of the light infantry team, because 20 points for a light infantry team is a lot of points. And because these guys are sort of so, you can use them, like you can push them forward, you can be aggressive with them and use them as kind of like forward roadblock elements or as guards for your link teams as your lighter link teams move forward. It's weird and kind of tricky and a little bit different to Infinity's normal gameplay loop to have units that work that way. So the easiest, at least initial way to use them is just these are just defensive pieces. I will put them in high places. They will be very annoying. And because they have mimetism and remote presence and okay defensive stats, I will just keep them repaired. You can build, it plays a little bit into a slightly too hackable playstyle, but you can build O12 lists where one Willpower 14 engineer just rolls up his sleeves and can repair basically everything in the entire list that might take damage. Despite the fact that I have two of these that I have 3D printed proxies for, I do not use them that often in that capacity, but they are an interesting piece, probably more relevant to the Beta Trooper link, but still like kind of cool and explorable, even if, again, we won't see any in the showcase list I'll show off at the end of this. Now, although the security link team is just an absolute kitchen sink of a link team, there are so many different things that you can add to it. There are so many different configurations. A lot of those pieces just are like, yep, yeah, sure, we'll just add it in. We'll deal with, we could talk for days about just the ways you can build a security team. I think I've kind of covered most of the things that I want to, but I do want to just quickly route through a non-composition bonus piece and just mention the Vidocs. Now, the Vidoc breaks composition bonuses because it doesn't count as security, which does make it a bit awkward to add and is something that you won't always want to include. But particularly if you're running a list that makes good use of NCO, and there are some, if you're not running like an active lieutenant, there are lists that will want NCO, it's a valuable skill. And because SWC is usually not too difficult to access in Starmada off the back of things like the 0SWC Psycom, an interesting upgrade, if you have the SWC spare, to a Psychop is the 28-point multi-sniper NCO MSV1 Mimetism Vidoc Multipurpose Security Brigade. Now, apart from having NCO, it's pretty much just a carbon copy of the Psychop across the board in all of the ways that matter. It's got a multispectral visor, it's Mimetism 3, it just has a multi-sniper rather than a multi-marksman rifle, and it has NCO for 3 points and 1.5 SWC more. Now, the multi-marksman rifle is a very capable weapon, but there are just times and places in any game of Infinity where being only 24-inch range doesn't quite cut it, particularly on a fragile link, right? A light infantry link that doesn't really want to move forward into the midfield. And so if you are looking for a firepower piece in maybe a smaller light infantry security team, and you don't want to take a Kappa because they're just BS12 with no visual mods, I do feel like in certain lists the Vidoc multi-sniper FTO option is a very explorable piece. Now, I'm not speaking from experience there. The Vidoc was added to this faction kind of only relatively recently. I believe it's a reinforcement profile. I have not used it in Starmada. I've only used it in Torchlight Brigade. But it's a piece that I think is worth investigating if you are playing Starmada in these tail days of N4, and definitely worth keeping an eye out toward in N5, particularly depending on how link team bonuses work, and if a Vidoc can benefit materially from the bonuses that, say, 3 or 4 other members of a light infantry link team can provide. Now, from the light end of town to the heavy, I also want to talk about the heavy infantry link team that is available to Starmada, which means that yes, we are going to be moving over quite a lot of the other link teams. There are many link teams that you can build in Starmada, but I am not, for example, going to talk at length about the Chucksa Longarms fire team, or the Nyoka's fire team, or the Bronze's fire team, because they are all kind of a little bit bad. The Beta Troopers fire team, however, does have potential. It is not easy to build. And in particular, it is a fire team that really does start to showcase how the core, the bones of O12 being 12 point at cheapest infantry and not high AVA things like flash pulse remotes, do start to bite down. It can be really difficult to build a Beta Trooper link because of those limitations. Right, it's just not possible for us to shave like a casual 15 points out of a list by converting line infantry into flash pulse bots. And so because of that, really building a beta trooper link, particularly a big beta trooper link, is just absolutely a build around. It is going to force things like, say, a tag out of your list. And so that makes it a team configuration that, to start with, you absolutely want to, if you're going to play it and explore that space, you need to commit to learning it because it is a very mobile, very interesting, very versatile team. It has strengths, weaknesses, vulnerabilities. But it does also have some really significant capability, and it's a space that's worth exploring, particularly if you're a Starmada player that has gotten quite good at playing the generic Fireteam TM style of list, where you have the light infantry team and a tag and etc. You've gotten used to that kind of list. Beta Troopers are a very, very explorable space, and they are just good enough if you can work past the limitations of the rest of the sectoral to include them to be super fun to play, actually. So what do we get in a Beta Troopers fire team? There are three things primarily that will build a Beta Trooper fire team. SECU Droids, which we've already covered. You can have one SECU Droid in a Beta Trooper fire team, and you should, because it's 20 points and so much cheaper than anything else. It is the only reasonable way to start getting to 5. We can then have one Epsilon, who we'll look at in a second, and I think you should take an Epsilon as well, and that means you then need, at least to get to the maximum size fire team, you need 3 more Beta Troopers. And from here we have some interesting options, because basically all of these profiles, to some extent, have some teeth. Now, if you were looking at building just a 3-person team, you would want one SECU Droid, and then a Spitfire Beta Trooper, and then probably the KHD Beta Trooper. So that gives us, we can have a Tinbot, Spitfire, Nanopulsar plus 1 burst Beta Trooper. That gives us a Tinbot for the link. We then have a very serviceable Killer Hacker. Killer Hackers with their own Tinbots, or linked with Tinbots, are always good. And then we have the SECU Droid, just to make the link relatively cheap. It is unfortunately only relatively cheap, because 41 points for that Spitfire is not cheap, but it's Ballistic Skill 13 with Mimetism, and we have a suite of other abilities that make the Beta Trooper link really solid. 6-2 movement, genuinely good at dodging, Mimetism, and remote presence to structure heavy infantry, even with just Armor 3, BTS 3, makes them very, not exactly durable, but durable, because Mimetism and multiple wounds and decent enough armor and BTS is solid, but very recoverable, because we have that remote presence and the structure and the armor and the mimetism. Engineers are going to be very, very good at keeping that Beta Trooper link going, provided you don't get it stranded on a rooftop somewhere far away from help. And so as a Haris team configuration, I really like Spitfire, Tinbot, Killer Hacking Device, and then SECU Droid. Or you can alternatively go Epsilon Sniper, we'll look at them in a second, Dr. Beta Trooper, and then SECU Droid. And that combination is what also leans out very well into a 5-person team. And that is specifically on the hinge of the fact that the Beta Trooper Doctor is an actual doctor profile, not a paramedic. It's a doctor, which means it's quite reliable. Willpower 13 is not fantastic, but it isn't bad, and anything that we'll be recovering is likely to have a cube, so it's rerollable, totally fine. Boarding Shotgun Beta Trooper Doctors are just 36 points is not cheap, but that's a good close assault piece. It's powerful, it's dangerous, it can lead the way on a charge, it can breach, and it can recover the Epsilon if it goes down, and it has specialist bonuses in certain missions. And then we can just kind of build out the rest of the fire team from what we want there. So if we're building a Haris team that uses the Epsilon, we would go SECU Droid, Beta Trooper, Doctor, Epsilon. That's a very serviceable Haris team. If we're building a core and we want to use the Epsilon, we would go Epsilon Sniper, Beta Trooper Doctor, SECU Droid, and then at this point we would kind of want to decide what our other two beta troopers are going to be. We can run kind of just the cheaper profiles, but frankly, there is not that many cheaper profiles to be had here. The KHD is the cheapest profile, so we may as well go the KHD because it's the cheapest, and once we've added the KHD, at that point we're probably looking at either the multi-rifle Tinbot Firewall, I would say, or the Spitfire Tinbot Firewall. There's not a huge difference in cost there, it's really down to the SWC if you've got it, and I think having the firepower redundancy is worthwhile, but in total, that is a Link team that has mimetism everywhere, an MSV2 on the Epsilon, look at him in a second, multiple different guns, a doctor for the only single wound piece in the entire regiment, in the entire fire team, absolutely top shelf firepower because it is a pure core, which means those are ballistic skills 16 pieces with mimetism, which means that they're very good at taking face-to-face rolls. And at 6'2", especially the beta troopers are fast, they all have climbing plus. It's a very, very fun team to play. It's expensive as hell, right? It is not easy to include in lists, but you can absolutely build lists around this fire team. It's just that you're then going to basically be playing the entire list as pretty much supporting this fire team. But I have played it, and it is very, very fun. That kind of mobility, if you have tables that allow you to use Climbing Plus, and many good tables will, just really goes an incredibly long distance. So I have a lot of good things to say about this link. It's just that it is a significant departure from the kind of easier to build, right? Light infantry and tag and some good hacking and maybe a missile launcher and some warbands, right? It moves away from the list TM, but it moves away from it in a very interesting way. Now, I've been talking about epsilons in the context of beta troopers, so here you go, the epsilon. It's just a dude. It's just a dude, but it has those wonderful features of a full MSV2, which is a very nice thing to have, and ballistic skill 13, and mimetism 3. Shock immunity is kind of relevant here because we are actually going to be tagging it in with a doctor most of the time, and we get our choice of a number of profiles here: heavy machine gun, multi-sniper, or shock marksman rifle. You want to go, particularly if you're linking it with a big beta trooper team, basically always either the HMG or the multi-sniper. I think I've mentioned the multi-sniper talking about the beta troopers. In the context of a core, that is because your Spitfire on the beta trooper is going to be doing most of your chaff clearing, light engagement kind of work. And so it's just worthwhile having those armor-piercing rounds on the Epsilon if you do have to throw some smoke and put down a tag. And the fact that the Epsilon in a core link with the multi-sniper and smoke from a Varangian is one of the pieces that makes even the Avatar crap its pants. Like, a Cutter does not want to fight that thing. An Avatar does not want to fight that thing. Makes that kind of multi-sniper Epsilon just, it's going to open up play for you a little more than the heavy machine gun would, but by all means move into the heavy machine gun instead if your read on your local metagame is that, no, you're fine, you don't need a multi-sniper for this particular game or for this particular event. No one's going to be playing a cutter, no one's going to be playing an avatar, or you've got other ways of dealing with them if they do, and you want to just really, really put those Toha ARO pieces in the absolute dirt. You want to just absolutely ground out total reaction bots. For example, the heavy machine gun's higher burst is just going to carry you a little bit further. For well-rounded lists, again, I kind of recommend the multi-sniper, but can easily go either way. Now, those are our link teams spoken about. We're going to move now into the few other pieces that I would say do kind of form the meat of many Starmada lists, at least for me, and that leads us on into the Zeta unit, in particular the Zeta Lieutenant. Don't take the NCO, we'll talk about why in a moment. If you're taking the Zeta, it should basically be your LT. I promise you it is very easy to make the risk relatively trivial, and even if you are concerned about it, just get good and don't lose your Zeta. It's very powerful, it's very mobile, it is very possible to play a piece as ridiculously, with like as much ridiculous verticality as the Zeta has, in a way that is both aggressive and safe. You just need to make sure that you have the orders, you play it using good tag tactics, you move it forward, you reserve a couple of orders to pull it back every turn and put it into a position where it is safe, where if it's in an ARO position, it can guts, or it's just not in an ARO position if there's a predator out there that would genuinely threaten to one-round it. And provided you follow those usual good tag steps, what you get is, in terms of sheer potential, one of the deadliest tags in the entire game. Now, yes, it is only ballistic skill 14. It is not ballistic skill 15, unlike, for example, a Dragao. And it doesn't have any visual modifiers. What it does have is a hyper-rapid magnetic cannon and climbing plus on full tag mobility. And because you're taking the lieutenant profile, it has both tactical awareness and its lieutenant order, which means that even if it's just rocking in the small minimum, like, 5 troops plus the Zeta, it's got 7 orders to spend every turn because it generates so many for its own use. And it's climbing plus and the 6'4" speed that is really the source here, because a tag like that level of firepower, right? Ballistic skill 14, HRMC on a very robust platform with 6'4" movement and the silhouette size of a Zeta, silhouette 7, which interacts positively with climbing plus by giving you basically shortcuts on your trips up, tall buildings, gives you a piece that can go basically anywhere and get line of fire that your opponent just may not have seen. It is very easy, even for relatively experienced players, to just kind of miss a spot the Zeta can get to. And once the Zeta gets to that spot and is making plunging fire on things that you thought were safe, the game just cracks open. Now, what this does mean is that experienced players who do kind of know how to account for it will like null deploy even harder. They will pin themselves even further down into their holes, but you can make absolute use of the space that affords you. And so it is just an excellent piece. It's one of my favorite units in the entire sectoral. It's the only tag available to Starmada, but what a tag. And the reason why we are so comfortable playing the lieutenant profile is this unassuming guy right here. Now, look, I'm going to come out and say, I have played Starmada before the existence of the Ment agent rather. I played it at the Anzac Cup in Canberra. I won that event. I think the battle reports are still up on this channel. You'll be able to find them somewhere. That was during the absolute high point of Starmada power. I think ITS season 13, and you'll see why if you go and look at the lists. But I just raw dogged a Zeta Lieutenant all 3 rounds and just didn't lose the damn thing. Happily, that is no longer required. If you are a little bit less confident, you are aware of the fact that maybe you will take some risks if you run that lieutenant, the Ment agent has your back, because it is comfortably the cheapest, most efficient chain of command profile in the entire game. All of these profiles are solid. Like, take your pick. The hacker is fine if you want a hacker. But that heavy riot stopper assault pistol profile for 15 points is criminally cheap as far as insurance goes. It's a chain of command profile. This, alongside the Kappa Hacker, is one of the few truly aggressively discounted pieces available to O12 and Starmada, and just lock that thing in. 15 points for an order, a little expensive. 15 points for virtual immunity to loss of lieutenant because you have the cheapest chain of command in the entire game, and it's packing a burst 3 riot stopper and a ballistic skill 12 assault pistol, which means that if it needs to, it goes and does things as well. It's a specialist. Chain of command has bonuses or does many classifieds. Like, this thing is just an absolute lock in basically any list that is not running something like Duo Raveneye. One of them is the LT, one of them is a decoy, and frankly you could even slot it into that because you don't have that many cheaper pieces to be auto monkeys, and this guy just adds a layer of insurance and a hell of a specialist / backup piece if you absolutely need. The Ment is really good and should basically be in every list, and by being in every list just adds a nice layer of comfort, allowing you to run either active lieutenants or safely run inactive lieutenants with or without decoys. It's just an absolute banger of a profile for 15 points. Now, finally, in the, probably basically always take these, we have Varangian Guard. Only availability 2, I'm going to make a statement and say that Varangian Guard are the most overrated warband in the entire game because people think Varangians are good. They are okay. They are strictly okay, but I don't care because they are Fizz 14 smoke throwers. The rest of the package is really not that crash hot, and I think people often kind of overrate Varangians for reasons, honestly, that are a little bit beyond me. The weapon loadouts are fine. Those submachine guns are not going to be doing that much work with ballistic skill 10, but it is nice to be able to fork an ARO from time to time. The +1 burst chain colt is nice if you can afford the 1 point. If you can't, it's very possible to just downgrade to the chain rifle profile. And Armor 2 and Dogged is nice quality of life. From time to time, Varangian Guard will survive things that you kind of just hoped that they wouldn't, and be a real pain for your opponent. But the main utility of Varangian Guards is just, they're corner guards. They are acceptably costed at 12 to 13 points. and they got your back in terms of smoke, particularly being Fizz 14 is very reliable. Now, the reason why I think that they are overrated otherwise is that people compare them to some of the truly best warbands in the game, and they just fall very short. The reason why many other warbands are so good is basically just the trading potential they have relative to their points cost. And the dark and terrible secret of Varangian Guards is that they don't actually trade particularly well. Varangian Guards are very bad at actually doing multiple wounds in an order, unless you pay 13 points for the Trench Hammer, which does give you a DA weapon, or you have the +1 burst Chain Colt. So we're looking at 13 points there, and 13 points is pricey for a warband, right? The competition here is at its most expensive 13 points for McCalls, and McCalls are just in a league of their absolute own thanks to heavy flamethrowers, native viral or DACCWs, Eclipse, and better close combat. Right, this means Varangians are 12 to 13 points and are competing against stuff that is frankly half their cost and will often do as much or more. Things like Shaolin Monks and Demorlock Group in Nomads, right? Like these are, yes, they are irregular warbands, but they are literally half the cost, which means that their effective, like expected value is doubled relative to a Varangian Guard, even before we get to the fact that many of those pieces kind of can do the job of trading up better because they are better at actually winning face-to-face rolls if they get into close combat. Shaolin Monks can stealth in and then actually win the CC. Morlocks have got like weirdly good gunfighting and high roll potential. Varangian Guard are just solid. They've got your back and they are regular, which means they slot easily into a list. They don't require any particular demand in terms of balancing irregular versus regular orders, but they are not trade up all-stars. They are strict, useful, yet another 12 to 13 point piece that is a solid 12 to 13 point piece, but they are just worth that 12 to 13 points. You should usually take one or two, because firstly, that's all that you can take, and secondly, because that's just a nice number to have, you know, a little bit of close combat solutioning if you absolutely need to, a little bit of smoke to throw, a defensive piece in the deployment zone that isn't for once packing non-lethal weaponry, so it does actually present a threat to total immune models. Just solid utility. If you take two, you can duo them, which will, at least in N4, suppress their impetuous, kind of expecting that to change in N5. And if you want to, you can even do a very fun duo of a Varangian Guard and a Psyclop, which gives you in one combat group smoke and a specialist and a gun, and it's just solid. But my strong advice for Varangian Guards is to take them. They are part of your meat and potatoes. In terms of like the competition in the army, they're 12 to 13 points, much like a lot of the rest of your baseline pieces, so you may as well, but don't expect more from them than they're capable of delivering. Varangian Guards they find it difficult to really punch down the most durable things in the game, right? Their damage output is ultimately kind of limited, which makes them actually better at engaging stuff that is below their weight class. And although that's nice and you should be doing things that make the best use of your models, it is just worth bearing in mind that ultimately the output that they will have is probably solid but a little bit limited. If anyone tells you that they are better than McCalls, for example, they are setting you up to have unrealistic expectations about the sectoral. They're very nice, they're very useful, but they are that kind of utility piece, not faction-definingly solid. Now, from Varangians, right, that would kind of be the conclusion of our meat and potatoes, but straddling the line between meat and potatoes and interesting independent element, we have cyber ghosts. One of the small tragedies of Starmada is that cyber ghosts are only availability 1, because having 2 of these would actually be really nice. Now, cyber ghosts are a little bit Hassassin Bareed at home. They are better in many respects, but they are only Ballistic Skill 11 rather than being Ballistic Skill 12, which is a big deal on a Hassassin Bareed, because this is your pitcher profile. They are also considerably more expensive and a worse killer hacker, but to make up the difference, they do have BTS 6, which is nice, and they have stealth, which is very nice. Overall, though, you are still going to be taking one of these in many lists, because just having repeater projection, even on just a Ballistic Skill 11 model, is just really good to have. Yes, at this point in N4, guided missile play is pretty played out. We've all seen it. It's good. It's a useful tool to have. Some people find it kind of objectionable, but it's a useful thing to have in the back pocket in any list, and cyber ghosts are effectively what enables that in Starmada. They are also your only hacking device plus, and having access just to those few extra I mean, okay, so having access to white noise is particularly given we're dealing with a Zeta as one of the many one of the many firepower pieces we might use. Having a Zeta means that if you have white noise, you have smoke shooting going both directions. It's pretty niche as far as tactics go, but specifically, I guess, if you're dealing with a Marut, having the option to really put that thing in the dirt is kind of nice to have. Overall, though, look, cyber ghosts are your pitchers, and because pitchers are very, very useful in N4, you want to have a cyber ghost at least in one of your two lists, because there are games that just are made much easier by hacking projection. It'd be lovely to have two of them. We don't, we just have one, but one of them is very, very solid. Now, moving on from the Cyber Ghost into our independent units proper, our independent operators, one of my first personal favorite profiles, perhaps less taken these days because it used to be, we'll talk about it, very, very powerful, is the Roadbot. Now, the Roadbot is a unique and super interesting piece. The major downside of the Roadbot is that it is hackable, and that is that hackability does prevent it from doing like really deep attacks into your enemy's deployment zone, which is probably a good vulnerability because this thing is really capable of doing deep attacks into your opponent's deployment zone. A Roadbot is, for most intents and purposes, kind of just a faster, cheaper Sujan, and anyone who has played against a Sujan should just pause and reflect on that statement with a little bit of terror for a moment. Now, 8-6 move climbing plus is like as fast as it gets. There is nothing in the game that is more mobile this side of a drop troop literally succeeding the roll and landing in your deployment zone. That is just egregiously, aggressively mobile. It can cover ground that it has no right to, it can get places that it has no right to, and it is literally only hacking zones of control that present any kind of a threat to the Roadbot's advance uncontested until it gets where it wants to go. It's like that or hard AROs, and you have various tools to deal with hard AROs. And once it has used that hypermobility to get to wherever it wants to, it's really pretty good at capitalizing on it as well. It's durable. Now, yes, it looks like a single wound model, but bear in mind the interaction between no wound incapacitation and remote presence. The Sujan has the same rule, which is that because there are two levels of unconscious that the Roadbot can enter, if it takes two wounds in one order, it enters unconscious 1, unconscious 2, and then activates no wound incapacitation, which means that it is very, very difficult. Like, even a direct missile hit is very unlikely to put the Roadbot all the way to dead in one order, which gives it, admittedly, it's not like having 3 wounds exactly, but there are plenty of occasions where it will effectively be able to take 3 wounds before it is put down. And that's, like, even at Armor 2, BTS 3, that is tough. It means that it is usually able to deal damage and then capitalize on the damage that is dealt, pushing through and exploiting a breach. On top of that, it is a remote, which means that if you want to run supportware, it's a perfectly able beneficiary of that. The Red Fury and Marksman profiles in particular make great use of marksmanship, but if you want the cheaper option, you can also just very easily run something like the basic paramedic profile, usually with a riot stopper, I would say, rather than drop bears, because then you are able to fork submachine gun at ballistic skill 12 usually and the riot stopper and push your way through like enemy defenses. That also makes it a specialist and a very high mobility paramedic, which just gives it plenty of utility. And the only thing holding the Roadbot back is that ultimately these profiles do range from 23 up to 33 points, and the more expensive ones, are a bit more expensive. So if you build a list that like fully supports multiple Roadbots with sidebots are awesome, by the way, and really tries to go all in on the damage that they can deal, it does start to leave you a little bit thin on the ground elsewhere, particularly once we pay the 15 points for the Evo, like etc. One Roadbot in any list is a very, very good choice because that speed and utility is just very, very strong. 2 is a bit more of a build around, but they are fun and interesting enough, and there's really nothing like them. Right, like a Sujan with a peripheral is just a fantastic idea. They are they're one of the draws of Starmada. Yes, you have access to them in O12 as well, but having access to these robots is part of the draw of Starmada and one of the things that I really enjoyed. Now, to dwell briefly on history, there was a period, if you find yourself going back to the battle reports for Anzac Cup, where I played Starmada, you will note that I duoed them with Okos. Now, Oko Copperbots are just the 16-point forward observer remote. That was because during that ITS season, then those copper bots got marksmanship and firewall and tactical awareness, which means that I had roadbots that were effectively duoed with tactical awareness pieces, and the purpose of those Oko copper bots was just to slingshot those roadbots forward. Was it fair? No, not remotely. That was way too powerful for the points that you are paying for those pieces. That is gone. You can still absolutely duo roadbots with things like Lawkeepers and Okos, and it's solid. It's actually a good way of moving repeaters up the board if you are inclined to do so. The cost is a little bit high, ultimately bearable, and can be a fun option, but it's definitely no longer the optimal way to play like it was back when I was playing in Anzac Cup because of that tactical awareness. I will remember that time fondly, but much like O12 Prestige, although it was a fun year, definitely good that it hasn't stayed in the game long term. Now, to dwell just briefly on a few more pieces, Sarcos are something that has also been added relatively recently to Starmada, I believe with reinforcements, but I could well be wrong on that actually. But these are, there was certainly a time when access to skirmishes was something that Starmada didn't quite have so much, and Sarcos are very, very solid. Now, you won't get a sort of like true fog of war midfield where your opponent has no idea what's going on, but you have a reasonable number of solid and not too expensive pieces here, and some pretty interesting tech on basically all of these. The mine layer, just for adding extra camouflage markers to the midfield, is always a nice thing to have. The boarding shotgun killer hacker is a killer hacker, and it's not a bad one. And of particular note, as far as spicy plays go, the submachine gun Wild Parrot gives you access to a Wild Parrot, which is a fascinating piece of kit that very, very few other models in the game have, and can absolutely be used to devastating effect if you combine it with a suitably dangerous firepower piece to unpick certain hard AROs. Now, I haven't yet used Sarcos a ton, but in those circumstances where I have, they've basically always been solid. Ballistic skill 11 is on the lower side, but boarding shotguns, surprise, mimetism, and climbing plus especially all help make up for that, and the mobility afforded by climbing plus camouflage markers is very, very nice. Sarcos are definitely not an inclusion in every list just because they are an infiltration piece. Some scenarios will have exclusion zones that sort of disincentivize them a little bit, and they are expensive enough that in the context of the faction they can't be taken literally all the time, but they are a very nice, just solid quality of life piece to be added to the faction to give it a bit more flex and a bit more reach. Finally, just because I have a great deal of personal affection for them, I wanted to mention the Raptor Boarding Squad, which alongside Beta Troopers are one of the genuinely viable heavy infantry available to Starmada. Now, you are not going to be able to make great use of all of these pieces, but the Killer Hacker in particular is a standout because it can cybermask itself, and if it cybermasks itself, it also cybermasks the Davabot. Ballistic Skill 14 is genuinely solid. And although these guys do have the curse of the 360 visor, which is absolutely bloating those profiles by like 4 or more points, they are still overall a fun, solid, and powerful profile. The Davabot Heavy Flamethrower Peripheral is just super cool to have and to use. My advice for you, if you make use of this team, is to actually kind of prioritize the Davabot's survival. It's going to be very tempting to use that piece as if it were expendable to protect the Raptor, but the Raptor has 2 wounds, the Davabot only has 1, and the damage that this unit can do is much, much higher if both units are intact. Yes, this might mean taking a wound here or there on your Raptor unit at some point during the game, but if, for example, you have to move through a mine, like a camouflage marker that you think is a mine, I would genuinely suggest doing that with the Raptor Squad rather than the Davabot, because if both of them arrive intact on an enemy position, the damage that they do is much, much higher than if the Davabot sacrifices itself to get just the Raptor there. The Raptor is fine, it has a light flamethrower and a multi-rifle, but the combination of those two pieces, right, putting out both the heavy flamethrower and full burst from the multi-rifle is what's really potentially very powerful. I've only played the Raptor Squad, I think maybe all of twice, but both games it was very fun and very good. Now, because we are coming up on an hour, and that's about the length I like to keep these videos to, we're not going to go through too much more in the way of spice pieces, but just because there are almost certainly things that I have overlooked, to just mention a few things that, yes, I think are either good or interesting, but I haven't covered yet. Bishia is excellent. She's just very expensive in the context of the sectoral. Lawkeepers are held back very slightly by being single wound, but are hypermobile and have sidebots, and I love sidebots, so are fun and good to play. The Tian Gao is expensive, but if you can make it work, it is still a hollow mask jammer, which can be a very rude surprise for your opponent, particularly if your opponent is an Ariadne player expecting to waltz through all of your non-lethal defenses. And finally, Andromeda and Casanova are perhaps a little bit on the expensive side these days without being so reliable at over-infiltrating. But if you take both of them, one of them's probably going to make it, and that is a meme list, but it is a very amusing meme list, particularly when one of them makes it if you're going first, or if both of them do. You just try and hard infiltrate both of them, and if they succeed, even if one of them succeeds, it can crack a game right open. Now, in terms of our showcase list for this faction focus, what we have on screen now is what I would call kind of a modernized version of, yes, to an extent, it's the list TM, it is the generic sectoral TM, but because I am me, rather than running a full 5-person core, we are doing 2 3-person cores, one of which can be made into an impure 4-person link if we particularly want to, and early in the game you will probably want to do that. So, what we have in Combat Group 1 is a Haris team of a Psyclops, a Kappa Hacker, and a Raven Eye. This is a light infantry team, but it's got template weapons, submachine guns, multi-marksman rifle. It can shoot basically effectively at any range out to 24. It hacks, and every single model in that link team is a specialist. We then have a Cyber Ghost, because Cyber Ghosts, as mentioned, are quite good. We have a single Roadbot. It's a paramedic because that profile is the cheapest. But that profile is exceptional in missions like supplies, and because of the combination of heavy riot stopper and submachine gun, does make a dangerous close assault model in a pinch. We've got a Lambda engineer and Yudbot because you do really want an engineer in a list like this. We've got a few pieces that bear repairing, but one of them is the Zeta. We've then got a single flash pulse bot, because we can only take a single flash pulse bot, a missile launcher. This list does have use of guided missiles. If you wanted to, you could quite easily cut the Millicent. You could exchange it for something a little bit cheaper. We could use those SWC to upgrade one of the Psyclops into a Vidoc. That would be very serviceable, but if you can put missiles into a list, it's just a nice capability to have, and there is enough hacking going on here to make that worthwhile, even if we just throw some pictures out and then spotlight in ARO. We then have 2 Varangian Guards. Now, these are the cheapest Varangian Guard profiles. They are 12 points. It is definitely worthwhile if you can find 1 point here or 1 point there to upgrade these either to the +1 burst chain colt or more generally to the trench hammer. As I kind of mentioned in my rambling rant about how Varangian Guards are not as good as you think they struggle to do damage when all they've got are things like chain rifles and the AP CCWs. And moving them up to a double action weapon that they can berserk with does go a really long way. Unfortunately, there's just no points. There's no points to cut from this list without doing something like turning, say, one of the cheap pieces into a war correspondent. In Combat Group 2, we've then got a Zeta Lieutenant, because Zeta Lieutenants are awesome, and the remaining 4 models are a 4-person impure core that can very easily turn into a 3-person pure Haris. So we have, once again, a Psyclops, I love Psyclops, a Kappa Hacker, and a Raven Eye. That's the exact same configuration as in the first combat group. And then we have a Ment Agent. Ment Agent is great for all of the reasons that I mentioned. Chain of Command is just fantastic for the Zeta in this case, and we will usually begin the game with the Ment being part of that link team, which just is going to give that Kappa Hacker 6th sense. That's not something that is always going to be relevant, but from time to time it will be really nice to have and can save a game or stall out an opponent. Now, one of the things that this list is obviously missing and which you might wish to include if you wanted to sort of, fit towards more conventional tastes is, yes, just a proper core link with like a Kappa missile or something to make some hard ARO attacks. I have had great success with lists like this, and I'm not particularly afraid to use the Psyclops as ARO pieces. It's just important to follow the usual good practice for positioning ARO pieces, where you want to deploy them in positions where they can really only see out to their good range bands. For the Psyclops, that means you generally want to be looking for like a 24-inch range band, crossfire kind of like into the midfield or across the lines of approach to your deployment zone, but no further. And AROs in that kind of a range band actually can be completely fine. Like, that is still a viable hard ARO. Yes, it's not going to make any AROs against your opponents until they have crossed all the way across the table and are making the terminal approach to your DZ, but that's fine. In many respects, that's one of the best places to make your AROs against, because if you do stop your opponent there, if you do win the face-to-face roll, the consequences of failure on your opponent are vastly higher, because rather than having spent 1 order to move and shoot you, they've spent 4 orders to move and shoot you to try and make an approach on your deployment zone, and failing at that point can scupper an entire turn, whereas it's much easier to reorient a game plan if you had to move once or didn't have to move at all to engage your opponent's core linked light infantry missile launcher. So overall, I can recommend this list very well for basically any scenario that doesn't give you points for killing more specialists. You could even play this in something like Firefight, but just be aware that the majority of this list are specialist pieces. This list, if you count the Zeta, I think has 11 specialists, which most of the time is really nice. It means you can basically never be locked out of scenario. You have to be in retreat, I think, or you have to be in retreat to not have something that can accomplish the mission, which is just a nice quality of life thing to have, but it does mean that in a scenario like Firefight, you've got a very good chance of giving up those extra specialist kills bonuses, if that's even still a thing in Firefight. What year is it? I don't know, I'm an old man. Now, whether this is a list specifically that will transition to N5, I actually have no idea. There are too many unknowns at this point, especially how things like tags will change with the addition of no cover and limited cover rules, makes forecasting this list will be fine very, very difficult. I would expect to have to reapproach factions pretty much from first principles across the board. But Starmada is a faction that I expect to be able to transition into N5 very well, and if you're playing it while waiting for N5 to arrive, this is a very good list in N4, and I can recommend it well. Now, that wraps up this video. Again, as always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed it, and as a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. I take video topic requests from channel supporters. This video was one of those videos. Thanks again to Mickey and others who requested it. And I'll be back this time approximately next week, hopefully with some discussion of N5 rules updates, because we are expecting to see link team rules sometime in the next week. And that will be very interesting and a very big deal. And I expect there to be many terrible and varied takes. So you can expect to see probably a PowerPoint slide presentation from me about my thoughts adding to that particular noise. Otherwise, look, as always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.